Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be posting 10 more of my unpopular rock and metal opinions. This is a sequel to a video I did about 10 months ago here on the channel, sharing my first 10 unpopular opinions, and that video was a lot of fun, right? We got a great response with that one, so I thought, why not share more of my unpopular opinions, because I have plenty, and if that video didn't tick too many people off, then I'm sure this one will. Alright, let's start out here with a relatively mellow one. My unpopular opinion number 10, I'm going to say that Iron Maiden's A Matter of Life and Death is their best studio album, and, of course, a lot of people, upon hearing this, are probably going to say, well, what about Power Slave? What about Seventh Son of a Seventh Son? Or, Peace of Mind, Number of the Beast? Absolutely, those are fantastic records. I love those albums to death, but for me, in my opinion, I would rival this record here against any of their 80s works. Just a really heavy, raging album by Maiden during the post-reunion era here that I gravitate towards more than any other album in the Maiden catalog. I'd say it's underrated, although it does have, a core group of fans that, recognize this as well as, a fantastic record. However, when it was performed live in its entirety in 2006, 2007, when they were, touring this record, it did not get a great reception from the live crowd. They didn't want to hear this album in its entirety, but rather wanted to hear the classics instead. So, it didn't really translate well live, but for me, if I were to have been able to have seen that tour, I would have been in my glory, right? I would have been over the moon at the fact that they were playing this album live because, again, I love it to death. I mean, every song on here is a banger in my opinion. You have 10 tracks on this record, not a single bad song on here, with some standouts being These Colors Don't Run, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, The Longest Day, Out of the Shadows, The Reincarnation of Benjamin Brigg, right? For the Greater Good of God, Lord of Light, The Legacy. I mean, every song in here is fantastic, in my opinion, and gotta be their best post-reunion work, as far as I'm concerned, and one that, like I said, I would rival against any of their classic records from their prime in the 80s as well. Fantastic stuff. My personal favorite Iron Maiden album. Unpopular opinion number 10, A Matter of Life and Death is the best Iron Maiden studio album. Number 9, the Andy Darris era of Helloween is largely skippable, in my opinion. After the departure of Michael Kiske, Andy Darris would take over as the lead vocalist for Helloween throughout the 90s and, into the 21st century as well, up until recently, right, with the Pumpkins United tour that saw Kiske returning to the band alongside Andy Darris, which that's really cool, and I don't mind Darris as a vocalist, but I just think the material that Helloween came out with during that period of him as the sole frontman is, very lackluster and forgettable in my opinion. Master of the Rings, great first album with Andy Darris, but after that, there's really nothing there all the way from, that period in the 90s all the way through the 21st century up until the reunion with Kiske that I can really pinpoint as a great album, in my opinion. Very forgettable. I don't own anything from the Andy Darris era of Helloween. I'm much more of a Michael Kiske guy, and I do think that he's the quintessential Helloween vocalist. So without him in the band, Andy Darris fronting the group, definitely missing something. A core part of their band was missing. And, even though I consider Andy Darris to be a talented vocalist, just not on the level of Michael Kiske, and the material that the band released during that period is pretty bland and not on par with a majority of the stuff they released while Kiske was in the band. So, unpopular opinion number 9, the Andy Darris era of Helloween, largely skippable aside from Master of the Rings, and I'm glad now that Helloween are back as, with 3 vocalists, right? You have Darris, Hansen, and Michael Kiske all on lead vocals. Really, really cool, but during the 90s into the 21st century with Darris as the frontman for the band, just not for me. Unpopular opinion number 8, Tim Ripper Owens was a better frontman and vocalist for Iced Earth than Matt Barlow. There may never be another Iced Earth studio album again with all the controversy surrounding John Schaefer these days, but when it comes to classic Iced Earth, many would consider Matt Barlow to be the best frontman and vocalist that they ever had, but for me, I prefer the 2 albums that Tim Ripper Owens recorded with the band, those being, The Glorious Burden, fantastic record, as well as Framing Armageddon. I just gravitate towards them a lot more. Ripper first was the frontman for Judas Priest and asked to record vocals for The Glorious Burden as a side project, but would still be let go by Priest and would join Iced Earth full-time, where, in my opinion, he did his best work. So nothing against Matt Barlow. I think the albums they released with Barlow on lead vocals are fantastic, right? Their catalog is very strong, but for me, like I said, I just think the Tim Ripper Owens stuff is, my personal favorite, and I gravitate towards it more. Just, for me, essential Iced Earth and, the stuff that I tend to listen to more often than anything else from their catalog. Next to number 7, WASP are the most underrated metal band of all time. WASP were a band that were immediately shrouded in controversy upon the release of their first single, Animal, that made it very difficult for a lot of record labels to take a chance on them and heavily promote them because they were such a controversial group right out of the gate. From the Sunset Strip, they were too heavy to be hair metal or to be labeled as a hair and glam metal band, but looked too much like a hair metal band at first to really fit in with the metal crowd. So they kind of were in limbo and kind of walked that line for their entire careers, but nevertheless have a stellar catalog as far as I'm concerned. Albums like The Headless Children, The Crimson Idol, my favorite album of all time, The Last Command, their debut, all fantastic. Even into the 21st century, they've released some really cool stuff. So for me, I think Wasp are just one of those bands that never had the opportunity to branch out into the mainstream, and are a band that definitely could have been bigger, but there are definitely reasons at play as to why they weren't. They were a very controversial band in their prime, and a band that, like I said, not a lot of record labels were willing to take a chance on investing a lot of money in promoting them. So for that reason, I feel like Wasp are one of the most underrated metal bands of all time, or like I said, the most underrated metal band of all time. So coming in at number 7 here, Wasp, wickedly underrated. Number 6, The Final Cut by Pink Floyd is better than any post-Roger Waters era album the band released. The 3 albums they released without Roger Waters are The Division Bell, The Endless River, and then the first album without Roger being A Momentary Lapse of Reason. All 3 of those albums, in my opinion, pale in comparison to The Final Cut, a forgotten about and/or maligned record in Pink Floyd catalog from 1983, but in my opinion, a really strong album, really enjoyable stuff here, some of Roger Waters' best work. Now, Roger is one of those musicians that you really need to separate the art from the artist, but nevertheless, a fantastic performance on this record, the final Pink Floyd album he'd be involved in, right? The Post-War Dream, Your Possible Pasts, One of the Few, The Hero's Return, The Gunner's Dream, Fletcher Memorial Home, The Final Cut, Not Now John, and Two Suns in the Sunset are all incredible tracks, in my opinion. Wickedly underrated in the Pink Floyd catalog, and I'd much rather listen to this album, than I would any of those post-Waters era albums, which are not bad, but are just very paint-by-numbers Floyd, and are definitely missing something, and that something very well might be Roger Waters. So for me, I enjoy The Final Cut more than I do any of those post-Waters era albums, even though, it's all solid, it's all Pink Floyd. I just think that those records are definitely missing something. Moving into the top 5 here, rock and metal are not dead, they're just not mainstream. It's very easy to say that rock is dead these days, because if you watch the Grammys or, whatever award show pertaining to music, chances are rock and metal are going to get shafted. They're either not going to be included at all, or just, not going to be televised. The awards will be featured, on the pre-show before the event takes place, and won't be televised, which that happened recently on the Grammy Awards, or as I call them, the Shammies. But nevertheless, when it comes to rock and metal, the music is not dead. It might not be mainstream anymore, and maybe you need to dig a little bit deeper to find new up-and-coming rock and metal bands, but there are a lot of great bands out there doing fantastic work these days that definitely deserve recognition, and to say that rock is dead totally dismisses those bands that are coming up right now, and who's to say those bands won't carry rock and metal for the next 20 years or so, and won't bring rock and metal back into the mainstream, Even though it's not pop, it's not rap, it's not anything that's big these days, rock and metal are still around, right? Rock and metal bands are still making great music, and it's not something that's going to go away. So it's very easy to say rock is dead, but the fact of the matter is you just have to dig a little bit deeper to find some great up-and-coming rock and metal bands. But then you have big-time bands these days that just seem like a lot of them get unnecessary hate in the rock and metal community, which leads me to my number 4. Next to number 4, bands like Metallica, Ghost, Sabaton, and Slipknot all receive unnecessary hate from the rock and metal community. These bands at the top of their field in rock and metal these days, doing fantastic work still. Metallica have a new studio album coming out next month. I'm really excited for it, right? It sounds pretty heavy so far. Ghost just released Impera last year. Great album. They're on the up and up. They're going to be a major force in metal for the next 20 years or so, right? Sabaton doing fantastic work at the top of the power metal field, and they get a lot of hate by a lot of power metal fans. Because, why? Because they're at the top of their field in power metal, because they're one of the best power metal bands out there. They're one of those prominent bands. It doesn't make any sense to me, right? They're at the top of their field because they're good. They're a great band. And rock and metal should not be a popularity contest. It's about good music. And as far as I'm concerned, Sabaton continue to top themselves in the studio. It's not to say that I don't listen to other power metal bands or I don't enjoy the power metal genre, but for me, I think Sabaton are one of the best power metal bands in the world and get a lot of scrutiny because they are at the top of their field, and everything that they do, like all the other bands I mentioned, it's scrutinized so much under a microscope and doesn't make any sense. These are bands that tend to walk that line, between being mainstream and not, bringing metal into the mainstream somewhat, and that should be celebrated because, like I said before, rock is not dead, metal is not dead, it's just not mainstream. So when you have bands that are able to kind of transcend metal and go into the mainstream even a little bit, that should be celebrated. Slipknot are another band that everything they do tends to be scrutinized, and I don't understand it. Rock and metal should not be a popularity contest, like I said. Good music is good music, and these bands are all making great music in 2023 as far as I'm concerned. So, number 4 here, these bands tend to get a lot of unnecessary hate because they're popular. They're at the top of their field, and, sometimes you don't always have to make contrarian opinions when it comes to popular bands. They can be, great bands because they deserve the recognition and the popularity they get because they're great musicians. Number 3, Slayer did not retire too early. As a matter of fact, I feel like they retired right on time. In 2019, Slayer played their last show ever, and now in 2023, 3/4 of the big 4 of thrash metal, that being Anthrax, Megadeth, and Metallica, are still performing live, still active, but Slayer remain retired, inactive, and it's been a bone of contention for people like Kerry King and Gary Holt who feel like maybe Slayer retired too early, and something that's been up for debate in the thrash metal community as well. Did Slayer have more to offer? Could they have continued to tour? And the answer is, yeah, they could have continued to tour, but they decided to go out on the top of their game. Obviously, without Jeff Hanneman, they were definitely missing something, but Gary Holt stepping in, did great work with Slayer, I think, towards the end of their career live, and it's very unfortunate they didn't have Jeff Hanneman for their last few shows, for the last few years of their career, I should say, but I think Slayer did something that a lot of bands aren't able to do these days, and that's retire with dignity. They still went out at the top of their game, and that's not something that a lot of bands can say anymore. Look at a band like Kiss. They might say that they're going out at the top of their game, but the reality is they're not, and they should have retired about 20 years ago. So, to see a band like Slayer, who retired in 2019 when they were still presentable as a live act and were still able to, not disgrace their legacy like a band like Kiss is, I think Kiss could learn a thing or two from Slayer. So, for me, I think Slayer retired right when they should have, and now they can enjoy retirement with the satisfaction of knowing they went out when they were still on top. So, my unpopular opinion, number 3, I think Slayer did the right thing retiring in 2019, and definitely did not retire too early, but rather retired at the top of their game. Well, speaking of Kiss, it is in my opinion that Peter Criss had the second best solo album in 1978. Now, this is widely considered to be the worst or the second worst behind Gene Simmons' solo record, but for me, I enjoy it more than Paul Stanley's, and obviously Ace has the best solo album from 78 here, but I just love Peter Criss' solo record. I talked about this a lot when we were doing Volume 2 of albums that don't deserve the hate, but I want to talk about it again. Peter Criss delivered here with a very unique album, unique to him and his influences. I think that's fantastic. That's what a solo album should be. It should represent the individual performers and their influences, their, what they're fans of and what they want to incorporate into their sound. It shouldn't sound like a Kiss album. If all 4 records sounded just like a Kiss record, it'd be pretty boring as far as I'm concerned. There'd be no diversity between the albums. So I think Peter Criss delivers here with the most diverse album out of the 4, and I really love tracks like I'm Gonna Love You, You Matter to Me, Tossin' and Turnin', Don't You Let Me Down, Rock Me Baby, Right Hooked on Rock and Roll, and I Can't Stop the Rain, an incredible album closer. So when it comes to Peter's solo album here, I think it gets way too much hate and is wickedly underrated as far as I'm concerned. A fantastic album. I think the second best, following Ace Frehley's solo record from 78, and not nearly, I think when it comes to, the bottom of that list there, I think it would have to be Paul Stanley at number 3 and Gene Simmons at number 4. Not really a fan of Gene's album, and when it comes to Paul's, it's okay, but I feel like it's just Paul Stanley trying and failing to write a hit song over and over again. I think it gets a little bit monotonous after a while, whereas Ace and Peter are able to deliver with diverse, engaging records. So for me, I think Peter has the second best Kiss solo album from 1978, even though I know that's an unpopular opinion for a lot of people. I gotta be careful with my words on this one because I'm sure my opinion is gonna set some people off, but nevertheless, it is my opinion. I feel like Jason Newsted was a better live bassist for Metallica than Cliff Burton was. Now, obviously, I know, very unpopular opinion. Cliff Burton, one of the greatest of all time. He did incredible work in the studio with Metallica, influenced them exponentially as well, and contributed so much to the first few albums, but in a live setting, I mean, just look at what Jason Newsted brought to the table. Incredible backing vocals, an extremely talented bassist in his own right, and, just listen to the backing vocals on Creeping Death. I mean, that was a song that Jason Newsted took and made it entirely his own, And now with Rob Trujillo on the bass, he's done some great work with the band. I love Rob, but when it comes down to it, I think Jason Newsted did the best work on bass with Metallica, especially live. I mean, just bringing so much aggression to the table, especially during that time when Metallica were straying from thrash metal. You still had Jason Newsted in the band band bring a dosage of heaviness that the rest of the band were just not delivering in the mid-90s as far as I'm concerned. So for me, Jason Newsted, the best live bassist Metallica ever had. No disrespect to Cliff Burton or Rob Trujillo, both extremely talented guys, but for me, I just prefer Newsted in a live setting. I think he brought so much to Metallica's live set, so much aggression, and so much to give. I think that he had for Metallica, and really did benefit their live set exponentially as well in the 90s when he was in the band doing incredible work with Metallica. So for me, I just prefer him over Cliff or Rob in a live setting. So that wraps up Volume 2. 10 more unpopular opinions here for rock and metal. Hopefully I didn't tick too many people off, but I'm sure I did with some of these. Nevertheless, if you enjoyed this video or if you agree with me, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel down below. Turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload. And let me know down in the comments below, what are some of your unpopular rock and metal opinions? I'd love to hear them. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.